and I want to respect everybody's time and get started. So welcome. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to share with you my perspective on animal welfare audits, their applications and limitations. Truly appreciate y'all taking the time to join me today and really start this conversation about building a better and more compassionate food system. As a reminder, we have set this up as a webinar. I don't know if you can handle this admins, Cass. Okay, thank you. We set this up as a webinar, point taken. So unfortunately, there's no real live chatting, but we will have the Q&A open. On that note, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Cassandra Tucker. She is our Chief Science Officer for Kinder Ground and co-founder. She is in the hot seat today as the co-pilot, so she's got the harder job. She's going to organize, pay attention to the Q&A, organize all the questions, so you may not see them pop up right away. If there's pressing questions that really affect the in the moment, she'll try to address those in the Q&A immediately. But for the most part, we're going to wait till the end. We should have plenty of time for that at the end, and so we want to give those questions the time that they deserve. So that'll work. If we can get it going. All right. So additional housekeeping notes, making sure that we address all perceived or actual conflicts of interest. Again, my name is Dr. Jennifer Walker. I work for and represent Kinder Ground. Kinder Ground is a 501c3 registered in the state of Tennessee. And as such, we do accept donations from various businesses, persons, and granting agencies. If you'd like to have more information regarding specific donors, salaries, or lack thereof, my past employment history, please feel free to reach out to info@Kinder Ground. So on that note, again, with respect to everyone's time, let's just jump right in and get started with animal welfare audits, their application and limitations. An alternate title for this would be, after 15 years managing animal welfare for dairy processors, I stepped away to run a fund for good, and here's why. So over the next 40 or so minutes, we're gonna cover a high-level overview of animal welfare audits and programs. After this, my hope is that no matter what your role is in the supply chain, you'll be better positioned to ask critical questions and set informed and meaningful expectations of your suppliers. For those of you on the farm or audit side, hopefully this will make you take a step back and consider how we might think about improving this process. I've laid out some mile markers along the way, hopefully to give you an idea of what we're going to cover, and more importantly, to help keep me on track. So first, we're going to make sure we're all on the same page, and we're going to do a quick touch base on some definitions when it comes to animal welfare audits and auditing. Next, we'll review the 7 must-haves of a good audit. Once we understand what makes for a good audit or audit tool, we're going to check out the must-haves of a meaningful audit program. And then we'll wrap it up and talk about those applications and limitations of audits and share some examples of successes and my thoughts about the future. All right, so let's jump on in. Animal welfare. First things first, let's level set on a definition of animal welfare and what it means. Here, I want to consider animal welfare in the simplest of terms. We really don't need to make it complicated, because when I chat with farmers, I talk about animal welfare in 3 big buckets, period. The basics, animal health, and the animal's nature. Bucket 1 is the basics, AKA don't be a jerk, okay? So this isn't really the basics. I'm talking abuse, neglect, timely euthanasia, humane death, moribund animals, animals with severe conditions. All things that are indisputably negative from the point of view of the animal experiencing it. Non-negotiables. Again, pretty basic, pretty simple. Don't be a jerk. Bucket number 2 is animal health. I think this bucket is what folks think about most when we talk about animal welfare. So much so that we also tend to be a little bit myopic about it. Making sure animals are in good health, injury and disease is minimal, feed and water, protection from the elements, all part of good welfare. And again, the easiest thing I think for most folks to wrap their head around. The third bucket is the animal's nature, and this doesn't get enough recognition or really hasn't been a priority. This is what I consider the pigginess of the pig or the cowness of the cow. So this really encompasses all those behavioral needs, what the animal wants and is experiencing. So pain certainly falls into those buckets, and even some of those things we talk about in the basics, right? The obvious things like this, but this is kind of going beyond that, really. And so, yes, there are some programs that do address painful procedures or managing pain, but few programs really are genuinely addressing highly motivated behaviors, enrichment, really thinking about quality of life. Some are beginning to consider that and address the nature of animals in production, but truly, we really do have a long way to go. All right, so next, we need to clarify the difference between an audit and an audit program. First, audits. It's important to understand that an audit is just the tool. It's a very important tool, a very essential tool, but it's just the tool. The audit sets the expectation. It establishes the way to evaluate success consistently from one farm to another and is essential in tracking progress. But the audit is just part of the program. An animal welfare program is the process, all the parts put together. A well-designed managed program certainly depends on a good audit, but it's the program that ensures accountability and consistency. The program creates the path to improvement. It adapts to changes in the marketplace and science. Program is what communicates the goals and progress. And most importantly, the program is really what dictates whether animal welfare actually gets improved. So if you take away nothing else from today, hopefully it is that audits don't improve welfare, people do. The last definition to consider is the type of audit. Big picture, there are three types of audits: internal, second party, and third party. Internal audits are done by employees, associates of the farm. They are essential part of the robust process, no doubt, right? But these are going to include audits done by the farm veterinarian, the nutritionist, or the staff. Second party audits are done by customers. These typically have a relationship with the farm. I do find that it works best when the second party auditors represent the quality function of an organization, because otherwise there's conflicts of interest that are more a hindrance to the program. So ideally, the second party auditor really should not be the same person responsible for procurement or contracts. So yes, I do mean that co-op procurement field staff have a clear conflict of interest when it comes to doing welfare audits or any audit, and really should not be doing them. The third party audits, these are what I think folks typically think about, and these are audits done by folks external to both the supplier and the customer. Keep in mind, to be truly third party auditors need to be paid by the customer, not the farmer, not the entity being audited, to avoid conflicts of interest. Keep in mind that an animal welfare program requires all of these, so it isn't just one or the other. So, and this is what Temple Grandin refers to as the three-legged stool an effective audit program. So all essential to come together. You really can't have one without all three pillars in place. So now that we've laid out the groundwork, we can talk about what makes a good audit. What does make a good audit? The standard. A meaningful standard is well written and addresses these 7 components. Let's take a closer look at each one of them. The scope. A good, well-written standard clearly defines the scope of the audit and strives to make it as comprehensive as possible. This includes addressing or at least acknowledging the black boxes. What do we mean by black boxes? These are the operations that happen before, after, or in between. So for instance, on dairy farms, the black box may be the calf ranch that's off-site or in another state. The livestock market where cows are sold. or a second farm. For swine, this may be a sow farm where pigs are born or where the boars are raised for semen a collection. For poultry, the black boxes may be breeding stock or younger stock. Outcomes. A good audit is based on outcomes. This means that success is defined by how the animals are faring in the system, not how the system is designed specifically. So this will often then include scoring of animals for body condition, injuries, or hygiene. Outcome-based audits allow farms to figure out how best to manage the system they have while not being prescriptive about the exact design or dimensions. Now, it does make sense to be prescriptive about some things: no tail docking, no branding, pain relief, no gestation stalls, no battery cages. But we know that no specific system or design is a promise of good welfare. So regardless, outcomes are critical. Criteria. Criteria need to be aligned with the goals and should include key welfare indicators. They also should have appropriate weighting. Now, keep in mind, weighting does not have to mean points. Criteria may simply be weighted by the urgency and the need for corrective action. Perhaps a topic for a different webinar, but for now, I will confess that my bias is that I am not a fan of point-based audits. I do not think it's possible to develop a sensible point-based system resulting in an overall score for animal welfare. Next are the metrics. Good audits have metrics that are realistic and actionable. Realistic metrics are set by using available data. For example, if the top 10% of farms have fewer than 1% injured tails, it would be reasonable to set the goal at 1%. It may not be a requirement, but the data is used to set actionable levels based on the goals and priorities set out in the program. So if the program is wanting to improve welfare, I would argue that goals should be set to the top 10% or at least 25%. If we expect progress, we shouldn't be aiming for average. Accountability. A good audit defines who is accountable for each step, the expectations, and the consequences. Farms have to demonstrate accountability from the SOPs, from records and documentation, anywhere from the training and then the corrective actions that come from the results of the audit. A good audit also considers the culture of animal welfare on the farm. This includes some form of internal audits, as well as a process to train the caregivers. And lastly, good audits stay sharp, making sure that they're revised regularly. Annual reviews are needed to make sure that the audit is functioning as it should, and gives an opportunity to provide clarification and make sure that those are addressed. And then thorough updates really should be done every 3 years. I think PACO requires at least every 5 for a thorough review for certification. All right, now that we have a good audit tool, let's explore what makes a meaningful program. There's definite must-haves to a meaningful program. A meaningful assurance program must have clear goals, meaningful standards, integrity, accountability, support, and it certainly should be making a difference. Let's take a closer look at what this looks like. Goals. When it comes to animal welfare programs, there are 4 potential goals that may or may not be explicit. The most common goal is to mitigate risk. Doing this requires that the risks are identified and they are either removed or addressed. This may mean requiring corrective actions it may be on farms with systemic issues. It may mean helping to rehabilitate the farm, or it may mean removing the farm from the supply altogether. In a really proactive situation, it may mean actually never contracting with the supplier to begin with. The key here, though, is that risk tolerance of the buyer across all parts of the business need to align. Too often I see a huge disconnect between the risk tolerance of quality, marketing, and the procurement parts of the organization. The next most common goal is to convey a commitment. This is often done reactively to alleviate pressure from activists or in response to a problem. Recently, I would consider it a common example of virtue signaling in the marketplace. Third is brand affection. While companies have been leveraging animal welfare-related claims forever, historically claims were really not backed up by meaningful programs or evidence. Times have changed, and today if a company wants to drive market share using animal welfare claims to increase brand affection, there's legal exposure that comes to that with false claims, and this should be incentivizing folks to really make sure that they have the receipts to back it up. But again, this will be a tie back to a company's risk tolerance. And the last goal that may be ventured for, and unfortunately the least common goal, seems to be to improve animal welfare. Now, the drive behind this may be to secure a future supply. It may be to demonstrate leadership in this space, or simply to do good, or all of the above. Meaningful standards, right? So that's the second requirement, is a meaningful standard, and we did cover this. So certainly a meaningful program must have a solid, good standard at its foundation. Integrity. How do we ensure the program has integrity? Integrity requires that we have a well-written audit tool, like I just said, with clear and complete instructions. So we see again the critical importance of that well-written audit tool. It also requires a clear and adequate sampling approach. This should account for seasonality, geography, and needs to avoid bias. Integrity also requires that we verify our findings. This is done through interviews, observations, and careful review of the records. Too often, audits are conducted as a checklist of yes and no questions with little to no verification. Lastly, integrity requires qualified auditors. Having PACO certified auditors are the first step, but it's not enough. Auditors need training and calibration specific to the audit tool being used, and not just once. This needs to happen annually, if not quarterly. This is critical. In my experience, most folks do not realize the amount of time, energy, and resources that need to be invested to make sure the auditors are calibrated and consistent. What does accountability look like? Number one is to make sure that the audit is PACO certified and publicly available. But that's really only the first step. Accountability means making sure that the data is consolidated into an easily accessible reporting platform so that progress can be tracked on multiple levels, from the farm to the auditor to different levels of the business. Accountability also means that the results are reviewed with the farmer directly and a plan that everyone agreed to is developed and followed up on. Accountability also means the right tools and a database are in place, and that this can be shared with stakeholders in a way that is transparent while still protecting farmer privacy. Lastly is having an independent expert advisory group review and update the program based on the results. Without each of these pillars, accountability is impossible and progress is improbable. Another important thing to consider is the preparation and follow-up that is needed to ensure that we deliver progress. And this leads me to support, which is what I call boots on the ground. And that's the next issue. What does support look like? Boots on the ground. These are not the auditors. These are the change makers. The right folks bring knowledge and relationships. When combined with this, this is where the magic happens. This is where trust is built. But for this to work, everyone has to have skin in the game. And by this, I mean money. This may be providing support to experiment with improvements, might be delivering on-farm training. It may even go so far as supporting a farm rehabilitation, or simply holding them accountable. At the extreme end, it may mean driving costs up in the business because you have followed through with the ultimate accountability by removing them from your supply because they simply can't meet the moment. Boots on the ground are the folks with the knowledge and experience and relationship to help prioritize and ensure progress. Again, note, you can't do this without this foundation. This is a non-negotiable. You need to build the relationship because this is the long game. Now, if you do all of this, a company or brand will be crisis ready. To be clear, no program will avoid all crises. But if you have a process and a solid history, you can manage any crisis. Last but not least is making a difference. If you develop, support, and manage a well-designed program, you can make a difference. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you want the change to last? The limitation I see in how we've been managing animal welfare in the supply chain, whether through industry programs or certification, is that it has fostered the goldfish mindset. If you've watched Ted Lasso, you may appreciate the benefits of thinking like a goldfish with a 3-second memory, which isn't really true. But anyway, we all love Ted Lasso. This is great for Ted Lasso and winning soccer games, but it does not go so well for farmers sustaining change into the future. To sustain improvements in welfare, we have to change hearts and minds. The reality is most audits are not embedded into well-designed, supported, and managed programs. Most programs are managed to drive compliance, not compassion. So whether it's for certification or a supply chain requirement, this habit of compliance has translated into checking boxes. And as soon as the folks stop looking or checking farms, the farms fall back into previous habits or simply fail to sustain the positive change because they never saw the value in it in the first place. We're going to put a pin in this idea and come back to it in a bit. All right, now for the capstone of our chat. We're nearly at the end of the journey. Let's talk about those applications and limitations of audits. How we apply animal welfare audits depends on which goal we've decided to aspire to. Remember those 4 possible goals we outlined earlier, okay? Recall that what a company decides to do will, or at least should, depend on its risk tolerance, as well as their genuine aspirations relative to the connection to the farm, right? So this will be dependent on the supply. It will also depend on its willingness to support the path forward. Now, how and if each of these are achieved will depend on that approach. So we have those 4 possible approaches, right? So we have the promise, okay? This is the easiest approach. We'll call it the pinky swear, okay? The promise. The second approach is going for some sort of certification. The third approach would be strict adherence to a standard. And the fourth, and my preferred option, is making a difference through a meaningful program. The key thing to understand is exactly what each of these approaches actually delivers. So let's go through that. All right. So if we're going to look at a promise, today, again, I would call this virtue signaling. It conveys aspirations of the brand. It may earn some brand affection, which is why it's in the faint gray, but no guarantees, right? So we convey a commitment. That's about it. What about certification? It's important to differentiate between third-party audits and certification. You can have a program that is third-party audited and not have, need, or want a certification, okay? But certification may mitigate some risk. It definitely conveys commitment. And like the promise, it may or may not earn you some brand affection, okay? The third approach is actually enforcing the standard. And by that, I mean truly enforcing it, not making excuses, not pushing back on the program, not giving a farm one chance after another to redeem themselves just because you're really tight on supply and you can't afford to let them go, right? So if the standard is enforced, risk can be mitigated and the company can convey the commitment for sure. The opportunity here to leverage brand affection is minimal, unless the standard is substantively different from the industry minimum. This is also why improving welfare is a maybe. So yes, you will address the egregious issues for sure, which is important, totally important, but that bar is pretty low. So it's often, again, limited to that first bucket of basics of animal welfare. It's only with the meaningful program that we can actually achieve all of these goals. Now, the sticky wicket here is that we need to highlight is that the differences across each of these is cost and risk. As you move across from left to right, cost increases significantly, and more importantly, risk decreases significantly. So let's take a closer look at each of these and understand why. Now, I provided a read in preparation for this webinar. Hopefully you had a chance to look at it. If not, no big whoop, because there are plenty of other examples across the spectrum of food supply or food safety, animal welfare, carbon, that demonstrate the challenges we have with certification. Based on my experience, most certifications use only third-party audits, and that is only one leg of the three-legged stool. We remember Temple's three-legged stool approach, right? In fact, certifications are not only missing two of the legs of the three-legged stool, they are often swimming in conflicts of interest. So for most certifications, the auditee is paying the auditor, which is a clear conflict of interest. Second, the certifier is typically paid some sort of marketing fee for use of their logo on pack. This may be calculated on product sales, on volume, of number of farms, but in some cases, this translates into millions of dollars a year paid to the certifier. There are also issues that tie back to our earlier points about the importance of the audit tool having a robust program. A few certifications out there are actually PACO certified, and they have really no semblance of a meaningful program that I'm aware of anyway. This leads us to some myth busting, my favorite thing. Big myth, let's do some myth busting. Big myth number one, consumers will pay for better welfare. Big fat myth, they don't, at least not consistently. Quality always comes first, then price. The reality is consumers rarely live up to their moral intentions when shopping for food. They tell us they'll pay more, but they literally don't have the receipts to prove it. Don't get me wrong, all things being equal, animal welfare can drive market share, okay? If the price difference is minimal, folks will reach for a brand they connect with, no doubt. What about certification as it relates to the fourth goal, improving animal welfare? It's worth considering that no animal welfare certification that I am aware of has ever demonstrated that they have improved welfare. So let's unpack this one a little bit, because that brings me to myth number two. Animal welfare certifications improve welfare. Myth. Certifications do 6 things. They generate revenue for the certifying body. They generate revenue for audit companies. They drive costs into the system, primarily at the processor level. They actually create or amplify risk for the brand. This is due partly to how they're managed and partly due to being targeted for false claims lawsuits by activists that are trying to prove a point, which they have. And then certifications check welfare 1 day of the year. The other 364 days of the year, they take no responsibility. They provide no support to the farmers to implement change or improvement. And lastly, and most importantly, animal welfare certifications and audits as they have been managed today, thus far in the supply chain, have driven a culture of compliance, not compassion. Many other issues abound when it comes to not having a meaningful program, from, again, a lack of qualified auditors, adequate calibration, poorly written audits, zero transparency in reporting findings, and most importantly, no progress, no evidence of progress on improving welfare. Let's look at a little case study. Cook's Venture. This is the most recent example that I know. This actually hits on several issues. This venture capital funded startup was committed, air quotes, to animal welfare. And they demonstrated this by its GAP Level 4 and Certified Humane certification. They promoted the better chicken fallacy, saying they were determined to change the way we do chicken. Consumers say they want free range and slow growing birds. Now, the question really is this actually a promise of better welfare? There is a lot to unpack here on this better chicken commitment. And if y'all are interested, I will organize a webinar specifically on that because it's a doozy. But the question related to today's discussion is, how did it turn out? Well, consumers cared and cooks cared so much that Cook's filed for bankruptcy. They closed the stores, leaving farmers with no options and no feed, forcing the state to manage the killing of hundreds of thousands of chickens. Consumers didn't pony up, neither did GAP, neither did Certified Humane. Nobody came running to the rescue to protect the welfare of the birds certified under those programs. No support, definitely no skin in the game. All right, so let's talk then. If not certification, what about industry standards? They certainly convey commitment. Today, every major farmed animal species in the US has an industry program establishing a minimum standard for animal welfare. When it comes to improving welfare, some do better than others. So I would say dairy, slaughter, poultry, they each have mandatory animal welfare audits. Pork and beef are flirting with some version of mandatory audits. Now, cow, calf operations, livestock markets, heifer ranches, and some phases of poultry remain in that black box we talked about earlier. When it comes to mitigating risk, the US dairy industry, as an example, has developed an admirable and robust process for managing compliance of farms that fail to meet those basics. So basic bucket number one, fail to meet the basic standards of care and handling, while requiring also at least some mode of pain mitigation. But whether risk is truly managed depends on the buyer. Unfortunately, enforcement is often dependent on the cooperation of the milk buyer and can be hindered by the risk tolerance of procurement. That is more concerned about forecasted demand and availability of supply. When it comes to improving animal welfare, if enforced, this addresses bucket number one, the basics. As for the health bucket, each standard, they set out best practices, but few, if any, require adherence. So the farm program is now making folks work on lameness, so that's great. But we have to admit that a 3-year corrective action timeline, is kind of like me telling you I'm going to lose 15 pounds by 2027, and then, running out to eat pizza and ice cream, figuring that I can work on that sometime in 2026. So that should be considered. When it comes to providing a life worth living, addressing that third bucket, the animal's nature and experience, we've really only begun by addressing pain, which we could probably argue I should just put in that don't be a jerk bucket, to be honest. So no doubt, absolutely, those steeped in this work will insist that there's much more progress worthy of note, and I agree. But really, progress isn't the point. So I think if we're honest, we have to admit when it comes to animal welfare, the bar is set pretty low. 15 years into the farm program, and like I said, they have a heck of a compliance program for the don't be a jerk bucket. But we still tolerate lameness at 25%, just to name one persistent issue. So if enforced at all, corrective actions are limited to paperwork, training, and the very basics of good stockmanship, including timely and humane euthanasia. There are no requirements for internal audits, and only a percentage undergo third-party audits. To put it bluntly, our written, occasionally enforced standard is don't be a jerk. Certainly a reasonable expectation. As with certification, it does seem that our historic approach to advancing and enforcing the industry standard has also driven a habit of compliance, not compassion. So what's the answer? Is there a better way? Yes. Let's revisit the benefits of a meaningful welfare program. Done well, a meaningful welfare program can mitigate risk and manage risk when it manifests. We will have the data that allows us to share our commitments with confidence when we have a meaningful program. And yes, we can build brand affection. We may not be able to charge more, but we can certainly sell more. And I have yet to meet the CEO who doesn't want to increase sales. And with a meaningful program, we can most definitely improve welfare. The one thing we have left to decide is how long do we want our impact to last? How do we create lasting change? So let's talk about developing a habit of compassion instead of compliance and wrap it up with a couple of case studies. Whether or not a company is intending to make a lasting difference or simply create a moment that they can market is a critical question that has to be considered. Why is this important? When we create a culture of compliance, we backslide as soon as times are hard, as soon as attention is diverted. It is abundantly clear that neither corporate or legislative mandates have staying power or support we can count on. Sustained change starts at the ground floor. Boots on the ground, bottom up, not top down. Top down worked on the low-hanging fruit, like tail docking, pain mitigation. I hate to say it, but that was the easy stuff. We have to create change that outlasts corporate and legislative chaos. We have to create change inspired by the farm, bottom up, not top down. We have to accept that the goal is not perfection. It's not someone's version of an ideal farm. It's understanding that there are billions of animals in the system today that would benefit from better. We need to be willing to accept better and appreciate that better is better, not perfect. And lastly, we need to recognize that all of this requires that farmers and animal caregivers believe and are willing to consider that there might be a better or different way of doing things that can give animals in their care a better life, and that it's worth the effort. We need to make the risk of trying low enough that their moral imagination is allowed to soar and they can think outside the box. What does that look like? Well, let's have a case study. So I have to give credit where credit is due. It was through my work at Danone North America where we had the funds to give brushes and other resources to farmers, where I was reminded of the challenge and opportunity of changing hearts and minds. This was a lesson I knew all too well from my years in private practice, and I had somehow forgotten it, having become so focused on the compliance-driven culture we use to get the industry to that minimum standard. Brushes and shades. Two key principles at work. Number one is that farmers need to see it for themselves. And number two, that farmers learn best from experience and other farmers. So these two examples. At Danone North America, we gave a brush to every farm when they had an audit. It was supposed to just make the sour taste of the audit go down a little bit better. But what it did was remind me how important it was for the farmers to see for themselves. Oftentimes we would give them the brushes and they would kind of shrug and say, whatever, fine, I'll put up the brush. And inevitably, once they installed the brush and got to witness this, we would hear back from them and they would say, oh my gosh, I had no idea how much the cows love the brushes. And no news to us, but again, it touched on that part of the farm that made them look at the cows differently and what was important to them and what they needed. Our second case study was with shades. So we've all heard it. Farmers will say, our cows are used to the heat. We have lots of cows out there, whether they're in dry lots, feed lots, and organic, where they are required to be out on pasture, where they have zero shade. And we know that shade is an important resource to cows. Oftentimes when I talk to farmers, again, they would say, oh, my cows are used to the heat. And I would kind of quippily and, snarkily quip back, no, your cows are just used to disappointment. There is a difference, right? But all jokes aside, it was important. And so we found a couple of thought leaders in a few of the organization and some farmers that would be willing to try, right? So I ask them, like, what's the harm in trying? There's lots of challenges with shade. Absolutely. Let's see if we can solve those. So we invested in some pretty expensive shades. But the cows voted with their feet. And once the farmers saw this, even on relatively cool days, 65 degrees, they saw cows actively seeking shade, and it opened their eyes and they realized just how important that was. So great lesson for everybody, including myself. Case study number 2, from police to partner. So moving away from my work at Know North America to Kinder Ground, we applied these principles and learnings. Now, I'm happy to discuss the specific of this project offline, or you can take a look at our website. But long story short, what started as a project to test some technology turned into an on-farm consultation, the development of our Kinder Hoof Care Academy, in addition to a follow-up project on cow comfort. The aha moment was when I returned to the farm on a Saturday, passing through the area, stopping by to do a quick task. I was getting organized, and the herdsman emerged from the barn, proudly wearing his Kinder Ground hoodie, which was so awesome. But he actually came up to me actively and said, hey, do you need any help? And that was the moment that I realized or remembered that when we actually do this right, we can move from being perceived as the police to being partners. And to me, that was everything. That was the theory of change. Now, I'm not going to lie, I knew all of this in practice. And for some reason, again, I had to learn it or relive it all over again to rewrite it in my brain and realize that this is how we make things better. This is how we find better ways. This is how we foster a habit of compassion and make it contagious. Now, your next question is probably, how do you do this in your business? Well, the short answer is I don't think you do. Unless you have farms that are direct suppliers, which is a different thing. But if you're not that, I don't think you can or should, at least not directly. And that, of course, is my not so subtle plug for working with Kinder Ground. We can talk about that later. So the first step, though, is to work within your organization. If you want to think about this, the first step is to work within your organization to decide and align on exactly what the goal is. Too many, if not all companies, seem to decide on the messaging first and then fumble along the path trying to fit the square peg budget of a meaningful program into the round hole of the budget of a pinky swear. It doesn't work. In fact, millions of dollars are wasted in these efforts, not to mention the millions of dollars wasted on trying to support the promise by sending out poorly constructed sustainability and animal welfare questionnaires. These provide less than accurate assessments of the State of the Union and are a complete waste of money. That brings me to our next webinar to explore that challenge further. Animal welfare in the marketplace, the anatomy of a market failure. I will be sending a follow-up survey for your feedback, and we'll post the date and registration for this webinar in the coming week. And I hope you'll join to learn more. But until then, I encourage you to consider, if we genuinely want to improve the lives of farm animals, I think we need to consider and question, one, whether the energy and money that we spend on certifications as well as supplier surveys asking about it are really accomplishing anything for the animals that they claim to be representing. And number two, we need to commit to strictly and consistently enforcing the industry standard. That means holding your suppliers accountable at every level. This means knowing enough about the supplier to know what questions to ask. More on that in the next webinar. But again, if you only take away one thing from the last 45 minutes, I hope that it is audits don't improve welfare, people do. And with that, we will move to Q&A, and I'll come off screen sharing because I don't think we need the slides anymore. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us, and encourage you to ask questions. I'm going to stop sharing, see if this works, Cass. Cass can come off because Cass is going to answer all the questions, quite frankly. So what do we got, Dr. Tucker?
We're waiting.
Do we have any?
Yeah,
We
so
just
if
answered
anyone,
them all.
if you want to go ahead and type in to the Q&A section would be where we would see your questions.
Please. We answered them all. Heck.
Jen, can you say a little bit more? Can you say a little bit more about the move from policing to partner, and what you think, you know, that when you had that realization that that's the change that had happened, could you say a little bit more about how you knew that? And
yeah, that's a good question. So I think some of it goes back to, again, what I've seen. We talked about the three-legged stool, and one of my criticisms for certifications is that, the audit happens one day a year, right? So one day, some folks I know have recognized that, and over the answer wasn't to really build a meaningful program. The answer was to just audit more, right? So we don't audit once a year. Maybe we're auditing 2 or 3 times a year, right? So it's almost created this police state where it's just compliance, compliance, compliance. And I realized that in working with that farm, and I think what helped is that I had the context of working with that farm previously in our program, which was really meant to be, again, driven to promote improvements and not be the police. But it's still, because we were working on those basics that really hadn't been addressed before, they really did feel like every time we showed up, we were looking for something to criticize, looking for something that had to be addressed, right? And this was the first time, because we had worked with him on this project and we had come back, I could see that he truly felt supported. Like he finally, I could just tell that it finally clicked with him, that we were actually here to help. And that made all the difference. So then he was comfortable, usually any of you who audit, you've all been there where you're on the farm and you can tell folks you're getting the side eye all day because they're all keeping their eye on you. Like, how can I, or you've all been there if you've had a class, right? When your professor asks the question and I know that I perfected acting like I was like really concentrating on something and looking down. Don't look at the professor because they're going to call on me, right? We get that same, folks on the farm are no different. They know I'm going to look busy. Don't look at me, nothing to see here, because they do feel like they're being scrutinized all the time. And yes, there's a role for that in some ways in the audits, but that isn't where progress is made because they're not open. They're not open to receive it. And that's no different than you or I, right? It sounds corny, but farmers and the farm workers are people too, right? They respond to these things just like we do. So creating that relationship that I mentioned is just foundational to all that. And that opens up all those pathways for them to share and ask questions too. Because again, I can go on to the story because he helped me out. We went into the barn to work on some stuff, and he was open to sharing ideas about things and asked, like, he was thinking, I was thinking about, what if we tried that? And I was like, yes, we're thinking, right? We're not defending, we're thinking about welfare. So to me, hopefully that explained that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. We have a question from Daniel. Do you think agri-tech and quality data has a place in helping with auditing, especially the economics on audit scale and frequency that's required to reduce risk?
Thank you for the question, Daniel. I think there's a place for it, probably most importantly in helping us compile data and pulling data where we can bring it off farm to help us kind of manage risk, to identify farms that are sliding, right? Because we know we can't be there all the time. And from a risk mitigation point of view, we know that when farms are struggling for whatever reason, some of the first things to go are quality. So if there was ways to monitor that and look at that, I'm honestly becoming less and less of a fan of this idea of the cameras, scoring things and doing that. Because I think that's also driving the wrong behavior, to be honest. So trying to make them tools that the farmers use, less than a tool for compliance, I think is the challenge. But I think helping companies aggregate the data they have just to capture, like I said, the farm program does a great job. They have this platform where they do the audits and can summarize and do a great job. Other companies have some. I'll say Danone did because we built it. But most certifications that I'm aware of don't have a great reporting system. They're not sharing how many corrective actions. They're not sharing progress on anything. So we don't know how they're doing. I don't know. So to me, that's where there's probably a role. I'm not so keen on video monitoring, because partly that just lends to the police state of it, which I think drives the wrong culture on the farm. So it's that compliance culture versus compassion that I think that I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, that if technology is tools that just amplify our intention, if we have this intention that is already compliance focused, the tech can make that actually stronger.
Yeah.
Whereas if our intention is compassion, it also has the possibility to work in that way. But it comes back to how the humans are using the technology.
Yeah.
Carly has a question. She is asking, how do you identify the right things to improve?
That's a great question. And that is where, if you remember that pyramid, it's that knowledge and experience, that boots on the ground. It's the team. And again, I'll just give my team credit, my former team, amazing people, because you build that relationship. And as an example, I may have 2 farms with the exact same audit results. And on one farm, I might decide to prioritize one thing. And on another farm, I'm going to prioritize something else, because some of that, I'm based on the relationship, I'm going to play into the strengths of that person, of what can we manage, what makes the most sense, because one person might be actually interested and excited about something, right? There's certainly, again, the basics, right? Those egregious things, like those are non-negotiables, we deal with those. But when we're talking about really advancing welfare and that third bucket, that's where we need their imagination as much as ours. So it can't just be something I'm excited about, right? So that's the challenge. And so once you build those relationships, they'll help you figure that out. So to me, I think it is a very farm specific formula, because it's really based on the strengths and weaknesses of that farm and their challenges and opportunities as well within that system. So it is very farm specific, which again, I think it's undervalued and not recognized just how important those people are for the system, and also why they need to be independent and not part of, I would say, procurement or contracts, because that gets in the way of all of it. And so having those independent folks who have that expertise and can build that relationship.
Great. And there's a few things coming through that are about more one person was asking, like, what in the example, for example, like, so you're talking about this like farm specific solutions, and one person was asking about is thinking enough, and how do you that you saw this person like walk out of the barn, and they were asking if they could help, and you could see that they were thinking. And someone else is also asking about an example of how you make farmers believe that better is benefiting them. And like these ideas like seem related to me, like that their involvement in identifying which topics to work on, and then their connection with the benefit. Could you say, like, and how does that actually drive compassion? Like, could you talk a little bit further, like even in that one example, about how that unfolded?
Yeah. So it's a great example. So that was a project that we started testing some technology that we were interested in through Danone. What we realized was that we had this caregiver that was responsible for hoof care and trimming. And we were essentially said, here's the system, put it in, it's going to tell you all your lame cows. Go to it. It'll print out a list, right? Magic, right? It solves the problem. We identify your lame cows. Here's who you trim. And as we worked on it, we learned that he didn't trust the system because it wasn't identifying cows that he saw. Like, why isn't identifying these cows? I know these cows need my help. And in that instance, I learned, like, okay, he's worried about his cows. So he's saying, I don't trust the system. I care more about these cows. I'm gonna trust me. Right. So then we were questioning, like, what is going on? Like, what's the match? And so that's how we started that evolved into the Kinder Hoof Care Academy, because we brought in an expert, because it's not my expertise. So we brought in Gerard Kramer, and we spent a day with the hoof trimmer and came in because we wanted to see, like, tell me what you're thinking. And so we actually spent the day learning from him. So he shared with us, like, this is how I trim cows, right? So we kind of could assess his competence, but in a very unthreatening, positive way. But he could show us what he was doing. He could explain how he approached it. And through that day, we built a great relationship of trust. I think he understands and believes we understand that he wants to do what's best for the cows. This isn't about not trusting him at all. This is about wanting to help him do better. And again, certainly a shorter story, but as an example from that, in the previous month, and let's get the numbers wrong, but in the previous month or two, he had maybe trimmed, I want to say 25 cows. After the training, feeling empowered and trusted and given him the right tools. And we saw these things that were hindering his success too, right? Because we spent the day with him. We saw that he could use a better setup. We saw that he needed some better tools. And we talked to the farmer and explained to that, got him done. Lickety split, we got him all ordered, all the things he needed. We want to make sure you can do this well. He doubled the number of cows that he was identifying as not just maintenance trims, like actively bringing cows in, because we gave him the tools he needed. And he really, really felt empowered to do it, right? So he was always passionate about the work, but once he recognized that we were there saying, like, just let us help you, let us get all the barriers out of the way so you can soar, it completely changed how his mindset was, and he could come to us. And then again, as another side conversation that I think opened the farmer's eyes, one of the learnings we had from this was some comfort things around the trim chute. So I asked if we could Kinder Ground can support by putting in rubber around, like, we were already going to put rubber in where the cows were standing, but I asked if we could put rubber around where the guys were standing and working, and also put up a heater for the winter and a fan for the summer. And so the farmer was like, well, let's see what he wants. And he went to Cesar and he said, Cesar, what would you prefer? Fans and a heater, or a nice speaker to listen to the radio? And Cesar said, why can't I have both? And the farmer, I saw it click. Like, he's like, yeah, right. He's like, why can't he have both? And he's like, I feel like a jerk. Like, what a stupid question to ask. He said, not me. He said, like, what a stupid question. So get him a speaker, get him a fan, get him a heater, and again, when our people feel supported, it makes all the difference. And I don't think people mean to not do it, right? We get so caught up in what we're thinking, what we're doing. It's just easy to lose track of that. And that's where I think just having that support and having those people sometimes coming in from the outside just make us stop and think, right? They stop and think, and we do it different. So.
Super. Thank you so much, Jen. I think we're at time. There's a few more questions that can follow up.
All right. Yeah, we will follow up. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate your time. Dr. Tucker, thanks for being an amazing co-pilot.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.